When you're out capturing photos, raw files are a photographer's best friend. But sometimes when you get back to the editing room and open up those raw photos, the scene doesn't look like it did when you captured it in the field. Well, in ON1 Photo RAW, it's incredibly easy to take those raw photos and create the images that you envision. Here's 3 tips for starting out in the editing room with better looking raw images. If you enjoy the video, hit that like button, and as always, subscribe to our channel for all new editing tips and tricks. So my first tip for starting out with better looking raw images is to use the camera profile menu in the Develop tab. So in the Develop tab, I'm in my tone and color pane, and if you're using a raw image and you're modifying a raw image file, you'll have this camera profile menu available. If I open this up, we have the ON1 section of camera profiles, and then we have the camera itself that has a section of profiles for it as well. And what these camera profiles do is they emulate these types of looks into that raw file. And as you can see, by just modifying it to landscape, we have a much more vivid color in the scene, we have a bit more light, and there's an improved contrast as well. If I go down to vivid, you can see it's a bit more saturated. We don't have that contrast that we did in landscape, but we do have a nice bit of saturation. Now, I really like going down to the camera's profiles as well. But depending on whatever you're going for, whatever look you're trying to emulate, I would recommend using these camera profiles. They're really awesome for starting out. If I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, it's a very basic adjustment and quite subtle, but it is a great starting point for the rest of my edit, and it already looks much better than it did before. As you can see before, it's a bit flat, it's a bit dull. With that camera profile added, it gives it a bit more oomph and a bit more pop. Another camera profile that doesn't really get used that often is this linear raw profile. And what linear raw is doing is it's actually going in and making the look more dull and flat. You can see if I choose linear raw versus ON1 standard, linear raw is much flatter and much more dull. There's not much going on in the scene. So with this linear raw camera profile, I really like using linear raw and then choosing AI auto. Oftentimes I feel like AI auto is a bit too intense when I'm just using the regular camera profiles. So if I'm using AI auto, sometimes I'll use this linear raw profile and then I'll choose AI auto, and look at that. It's already a bit more popped with texture and detail. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, especially in the sky, it's looking really, really nice. So I'll just go back to manual here and I'll choose landscape. And again, camera profiles are an amazing tool for starting out with raw images. You can already see the difference in this photograph just by choosing that one camera profile. Let's jump into the next tip. So my next tip for starting out with better raw image files is to use a tone curve. So in the Effects tab, we can easily add a tone curve onto our raw image file using the Curves filter. And with the Curves filter, we can use this tone curve to manipulate and modify those tones in our image and create a much better base or foundational look in our raw file. So with a tone curve, if you're not familiar with it, the bottom left point is the blacks. And as I move up, you can see with this column here, this row here, it brightens up into whites. And it's the same thing on this line here in the tone curve. So we have blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights, and whites. So what I typically do on raw image files that are a bit flat or a bit dull is I'll drop down a slight S-curve. And by S-curve, I mean I'm going to drop a point in my shadow tones, usually right in the middle. I'll pull that down maybe 1 block. See how I dropped it down there, and then I pulled it down 1 block. Pull it down maybe just a bit more. And that's going to add in that contrast into the scene. So if I turn this off and on, it's already looking better. We have a bit more contrast and a bit more punch to the scene. And of course, you can always pull that down a bit more or up to taste, depending on what you're going for. But I feel like 1 block here works pretty well. Then we're going to drop a point in our in our highlight area near our midtones, about right there. And then we're going to pull that up about 1 point. Like that. And already, if I turn this off and on, it's a much more interesting photograph. We can see a lot more of these details, there's a lot more contrast, and there's a bit more punch to the scene. And remember, you can always remodify or readjust these points by just clicking on them and then dragging them. Now, one thing when it comes to the tone curve is that when you do create these S curves or you modify these different tones, keep in mind that you are affecting the saturation of certain colors within your scene. So if I turn this off and on, the colors in these contrasted areas changes up a bit and it becomes much more saturated. Now, if you're looking to eliminate that intense saturation that comes with this curves filter, head into the gear icon for the curves filter, go into your blending modes, and go down to luminosity. See how when I chose luminosity, that intense color in the foreground went away? That's because with the blend mode luminosity, it's only extracting the tone modifications from this curve adjustment and applying them to the scene. It's not taking any of the color adjustments, it's only bringing the tone modifications, the brightness, contrast, things like that. Whereas if I go back to normal, it brings back that color modification. And then luminosity to strictly modify the tone. My last tip for starting out with better raw image files is to pull back on the exposure. And when it comes to pulling back on the exposure, oftentimes people will pull back on the exposure of a scene to eliminate this sort of overexposed look, but then they won't modify any of the other sliders to fix that dull, flat, underexposed look. So for example, in this scene, it's quite overexposed. We don't really see any of those details in these clouds or in those mountains off in the distance. And it would be really nice to, see those colors and those details. So in this situation, head over to the Develop tab, grab that exposure slider and pull that back until you can see the details and colors and textures that you were looking for. I mean, already by pulling this back, it looks so much better. We have so many awesome colors and details in these clouds and also in these mountains that we didn't even see before. But this is where people will stop. They'll literally stop right here, and you'll have this sort of flat, dull, correct exposure, if you will. And it looks, like it needs a bit of an adjustment. And an easy way to bring the image back to life after you've lowered the exposure is to incorporate different sliders into this. Is to incorporate these different sliders back into the scene depending on the environment that you're in. For this particular photograph, I think it would look great with a little bit of a shadow boost, simply so that we can see these textures in the foreground. Now keep in mind that when I'm pulling up on the shadows, I'm usually removing contrast. So let's add in a bit more contrast. But think about when you're adding in contrast, you're also eliminating a bit of the light. So let's boost the midtones just a little bit. Looking pretty good. So if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard to view the original, this is the original photograph. And this is with just some sliders modified in the Develop tab. And it's just a much more accessible image now. Of course, we could go in and readjust a little bit. I think we could probably pull up on the whites a little bit just to ensure there's a little bit of pop. And then I'd probably go back with a local adjustment to the sky there. But I mean, even with that white adjustment, it's looking so much better. And so I think people stray away from modifying a lot of these sliders themselves inside of the Develop tab, but they're really, really awesome for generating a much more appealing look with your raw image files starting out. Those are my 3 tips for starting out with better looking raw image files. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.